How many time the actual clock for as well? Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Daniel Baer, and I'm an event facilitator here with the Keystone Province Booksellers. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 1 territory, and that the land on which we are gathered is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Aninawak, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, as well as the homeland of the Red River Métis. And additionally, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. And of course, we're gathered here for the launch of the Keystone Province, Politics and Governance in Manitoba, edited by Kelly Saunders and Christopher Adams. And of course, many thanks goes to the University of Manitoba Press for publishing this book and making this evening a reality. Yes. And in just a moment, you'll hear from the editors and some of the contributors of the book tonight. But in just a moment, before I introduce the hosts, a few quick words about how the evening's going to go. So following a quick conversation and our presentations, time permitted, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. So if you are here today and you do have a question, just raise your hand enough for me to see, even to the folks in the back, and I'll come by with this wireless microphone to ensure that you're heard on tonight's live stream, just for the folks watching at home today. And then I will be back to review how the signing procedure will go, just to the table to my right, but that will be afterward. But for now, I have the pleasure of introducing tonight's hosts. Kelly Saunders is a professor of political science at Brandon University, a frequent commentator on provincial politics. Her work on Manitoba Progressive Conservative Party has been published in Disengaged, Fixed Date, Democracy, Understanding the 2011 Manitoba Election, and Manitoba Politics and Government. Christopher Adams holds a PhD from Carleton University and held senior positions in the marketing research industry from 1995 to 2012. He's the author of Politics in Manitoba and regular media commentator on social and political issues. He currently serves as the rector of St. Paul's College and is an adjunct professor in political science at the University of Manitoba. Here they are. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I want to thank all of you for coming out. I drove in from Brandon, kind of white knuckling it through some terrible road conditions. And I was saying to my mom that came, I said, it's going to be me, you, Mom, and Chris, and maybe one or two other people that just wandered in off the street because the weather is so bad. So thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And as well, all of our contributors. We have a number of contributors here that Chris is going to mention in a moment. Thank you so much for coming out as well. So,
how does this start? Well, tell the folks how this project came to be.
Okay, that was not a staged question, by the way. We had a great launch at Government House a few weeks ago, and Chris and I just sort of engaged, sort of telling the story a little bit about the book and talking about some of the various chapters that were in the book, and thought that we would sort of start off the evening with that same kind of format. So the idea for the book really started 4 years ago. Yes, 4 years. That's literally how long it takes sometimes to bring a book to fruition, especially a book as multifaceted as this one was. And it really started during the pandemic, as many things did during the pandemic. And I was just sort of, you know, like for many of us, the pandemic was really a chance for me as someone who teaches political science, teaches about provincial politics, Canadian politics. And I was just really reflecting on the fact that I didn't quite know where things were going to go for Manitoba and indeed for the rest of the world, but I knew that we were at a turning point in our history. And as someone that studies politics very closely, I was really, really intrigued by looking at the arc of Manitoba, you know, our beginnings in 1870 and all the challenges and crises and amazing accomplishments that we have had. It was really a time for me to pause and reflect on what has changed and what has stayed the same and where are we going as a province. It was that kind of pivotal moment. So that was my idea. I thought, well, let's write a book, right, about this. And I thought it's too daunting of a task to take on by myself. So I thought, who is the person that I really respect, you know, the most when it comes to provincial politics, who really has their finger on the pulse of what's happening, and who it would simply be fun to write a book with. And of course, Chris was the person that came to mind. So I reached out to Chris, and
I said you should be asking Paul Thomas.
Well, you were the one, and luckily enough, he agreed, and we took it from there. So my question to you, Chris, is tell us how this book fits into some of the wider literature on politics in Manitoba.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, Kelly. So there are a lot of books about politics in Manitoba, like biographies. I see Jerry Friesen here, who's come out with a masterful biography of John Norquay. Others have written autobiographies or political memoirs. Duff Roblin, for example. There are many books out on politics, but there aren't books about the overall sense of what politics is about in Manitoba. So here I've got my little grab bag, and you have to go back to the first, of the modern eras, Murray Donnelly. You can see how old this book is, but it's came out in the early 1960s. And in this book, with Paul Thomas's buttons on the cover, but this is my book back in 2008. So you have to go fast forward many decades for the next book. And then after that was a book that many of us collaborated with and co-edited by Curtis Brown, who's here, Curtis Brown and Paul Thomas. And this is over a decade ago, this book. So you have to go back quite a ways to have a book about the overall picture of Manitoba politics. And I see Jean Friesen here. She wrote the chapter on the legislature and legislative buildings. So when we came out with this book, which is a masterful book with a beautiful cover on it, by the University of Manitoba Press, and I want to give credit to the designer of the cover, Kirk Warren. Kirk Warren has done a great job. It's just this beautiful cover. So you go back to early 1960s and only 4 books that cover the wide range. So when Kelly and I got together to talk about putting together the 7th volume, we reached out to a number of authors, many of whom are here in the room, and I would say that it was a real pleasure working with them. Kelly?
Oh, it was. Like after Chris said, I'm in, we sat down and put together literally our dream team of who are the top people, the experts in terms of Manitoba economics, the media and polling industry, the public service, crown corporations, municipal governance in the province. And we approached all of those folks, most of whom were here in Manitoba. And the response was very enthusiastic. And the chapters are just incredible quality. So we really lucked out.
Yeah, so we invited all the authors to come, and some of whom couldn't make it because they're out of the province. Royce Coop is quite ill tonight, so but anyway, Royce can't make it tonight, but we have a number of authors, and we're going to call up each of the authors who's agreed to come up just for 2 or 3 minutes to give their perspective about the scene in Manitoba from the perspective of the chapter and from their expertise. So I hope that's okay, and we're calling them up in the order that they appear in the book. So the first person I'm going to invite up is Fletcher Beauregard, who wrote the chapter Structure and Change, an Overview of the Manitoba Economy. So I think there's a microphone over here for you, Fletcher. And one of the enjoyable things for Kelly and me was meeting people who Fletcher I hadn't met before, and I think we have bacon and eggs one morning. But anyway, it's been a real joy meeting these different authors, some of whom we didn't know before.
Well, thank you. It was a real pleasure to be here. It was an equal pleasure to be asked to be a contributor to this particular book. Not just the token economist, I don't think, but I have to say that I've always been interested in that interplay between economics and politics. In fact, economics used to be referred to as political economy. So it's not an artificial merger at all. And what I try to do in my chapter, I didn't want to abstract entirely from the politics, but I wanted to try to shine a bit of light on some of the economic aspects, the economic dimensions, and especially the economic structure of Manitoba. So, and in that chapter, there's some, I think, indications of how in some ways we're similar to other provinces, and how in many ways we're different from other provinces, and different, I think, in a really interesting way. But having said that, so there's those differences, but having said that, I think my take on the Manitoba economy is that it's very much embedded in the national economy and indeed in the international economy. It's been that way for centuries. And that has a lot of advantages, but it is a double-edged sword. So what I tried to sort of indicate in the chapter is just what that double-edged sword involves, how sharp it can cut in some ways, and how Manitoba is sort of often responding to events that have developed elsewhere, whether in the country, whether in the world, whether in the climate, something like that. And that sort of story of adjustment to these external events, some that happen gradually, some that happen very sharply, a new one that sort of happened since the beginning of 2025, which is not part of what I covered in the chapter. But I think that's part of the story of Manitoba, and I think it makes for interesting reading. And I think it, I hope it's a good contribution to that sort of, considering that interplay between the economic realm and the political realm, and back and forth there. And I just also want to thank both of the editors, both for inviting me, but also for guidance, commitment, encouragement, and I think great editorial judgment. Thank you very much.
So our next contributor we'll call up is Dr. Malcolm Bird from the University of Winnipeg. He wrote the chapter "Still Politicized: The Partial Evolution of Manitoba's Crown Corporations."
Excellent. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Chris, for inviting me to write this chapter. As Chris said, my chapter's title was "Still Politicized: The Partial Evolution of Manitoba's Crowns," and I essentially argued that the big three crowns, that's the liquor folks, liquor and gaming, MPI, and Manitoba Hydro, are unique in that the governments, both Tory and NDP, continue to interfere in their operations, both a day-to-day, but also in a long-term strategic decisions, and that this is a real problem, and that this makes Manitoba somewhat unique and different from other provinces. Now, I have been conducting a bunch of research on other provincially owned, state-owned firms, and I'm actually not sure that this is as true as I thought when I first started writing the chapter. But anyways,
The second edition.
yeah. Anyways, I don't know if that's good or bad. Anyways, but the significance of this really has less to do with the liquor folks, liquor and gaming folks, or MPI. These are pretty straightforward businesses. They're not really that complex. The capital investments aren't really that significant. But the real issue is with Manitoba Hydro. Manitoba producing and distributing electricity is very, very complex, very, very capital intense business. And Manitoba Hydro is a complete disaster, and it's heading towards insolvency. And this is directly related to poor decisions made in the political sphere and imposed on this crown. Its revenues are just not covering its short and long-term costs. So yes, the power is going to go up by 3.5%, but that's not going to really make a difference. Its internal operational costs are rising much faster than its revenues are. Its debt servicing costs, about 35 cents of every dollar you pay on your bill goes to servicing debt. It's about 5 times higher than other utilities. Its generation and transmission assets are in decline and need replacing, and pretty soon we're going to run out of power. So it's really not a good situation. And this is because of poor governance. So this is governments interfering in its operations. We've seen a whole host of examples of this. We had the CEO fired. She was fired about 1.5 years ago. The incoming NDP government did what the incoming Tory government did before it, which was fire the board and replace it with people who don't have any expertise in running a very big and complex firm like a power utility. And more recently, we've seen the premier get up and make decisions for the crown, and no one from the crown is actually there. So you got the political head of the province making a decision about a firm, and no one from the firm is there to even ask questions. Anyways, whether it's rates or capital allocation or long-term planning, these are being done in the political sphere and not in the crown itself. And so there you go.
higher there.
I know. Sorry.
The next chapter author is Andrea Rounce, a friend of mine and colleague from the University of Manitoba Political Science Department. And she wrote the chapter Manitoba's Public Service with Karen Levasseur, Manitoba's Public Service under the Pallister-Stephenson government and beyond. Over to you, my friend.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you, Chris and Kelly, for the opportunity to be part of this book. Karen can't be here tonight, but many of you will know her as, well, in her own right, of course, but also as my very frequent writing partner. So I'm very pleased to talk a little bit about our chapter, and I probably won't be quite as provocative as Malcolm was. I never know. It's hard to say. So our chapter is about the public service and the broader public sector and how critical it is to democracy. How it's organized can have tremendous implications for how the government works, who delivers services and programming to people in the province, and how well governments work. Our chapter explores and unpacks changes to the public service under the Pallister and Stephenson government, and you may recall there were plenty of those, including key pieces of legislation that were designed to reshape and reconceptualize how we think about the public sector, including what we call the public service, which was a big change from the civil service. And we also explore some of the ongoing challenges for any government, all of which have clearly impacted the Kinew government. There are many things that we would point to that started or that were particularly difficult, maybe, or challenging under the Pallister and then the Stephenson government. But these are issues that have long-term implications and that are not easily solved by any one particular government or approach. Things like labor relations, which were, we might all argue, particularly difficult under the Pallister and Stephenson governments. Better in some respects under the Kinew government so far, but we'll see how that all goes. Environmental changes, things like, when I talk about the environment, things like artificial intelligence, digital government, relationships with the US, how have all of these things had an impact on the public service in Manitoba, but they're certainly going to continue to impact the public service in Manitoba. When we talk about the public service, often we want to talk about morale of the public service. And I'm sure there are many folks here who either have been public servants, are public servants, or who know public servants. And one of the questions that continues to arise is around how do public servants feel about what it is that they're up to. And there are lots of questions about whether this is better or worse now, and what that might actually look like. Manitoba has a pretty lean public service, and we've also seen pretty little haste to fill empty positions. Vacancy management is alive and well in Manitoba, and that hasn't changed under this particular government. We'll see how things go. We've had I think some positive changes. We have now a permanent public service commissioner after many years of an acting commissioner. So having someone permanently in that role makes a big difference. And when we're talking about the public service, we're largely talking about the permanent public service. So those folks who have jobs that are as permanent as you can pretty much get. But these are also folks that have been impacted by COVID. We're going to see ongoing discussions about return to the office and hybrid work. We have a premier who said publicly that he didn't think people should be working at home quite as much as they were, and that certainly shouldn't be the popular choice. But we've also seen new departments like public service delivery, innovation and new technology, even though very recently in a survey of public servants in Manitoba, we've seen public servants say that they don't really feel like they can be innovative in their jobs. So there's a lot of modernization pressures that we're seeing that are going to keep facing the public service. And this government is going to have to work through that process. And public servants themselves are going to have to work through those processes. So those are just some of the things that we're seeing. I could go on, but I will not. And it's interesting times. It's going to keep being interesting times.
Thanks very much, Andrea. The next author and chapter, Curtis Brown, my past colleague at Pro Research, and Kelly's almost a neighbor in Brandon, right?
That's
Because
right.
Curtis is from
Yeah.
Brandon. So Curtis Brown co-wrote with Mary Agnes Welch, the news, media, and public opinion in Manitoba. Over to you, Curtis.
Thank you very much. And again, as others have said, thank you very much for inviting me to write this chapter. Mary Agnes and I write this chapter. Worn a few different hats, I think, since Paul Thomas very kindly invited me as a graduate assistant to work on the book 15 years ago, or whatever it was now. But this is a tremendous addition to the gammon, and yeah, it's great to be invited to be among so many great people, experts in the field, to share their perspectives on what's happening in Manitoba. So, yeah, we, Barings Welch, as many of you know, my partner at Pro Research, and also worked for the Free Press for a long time. I used to work with Brandon Sun many years ago, which is how I first met Kelly. So I think in some ways we kind of had a bit of a unique background in terms of being able to write about Manitoba's media outlets and also polling, because that's now what we do as partners at Pro Research. And I think, whether we're working as journalists or whether, doing what we're doing now, we're really, I think in many ways our mission is to try to hold up a mirror to Manitoba and to sort of find out what's happening. It's something we did as reporters, and I think is also as pollsters as well. So really, I think in our chapter, we wanted to look at, how the news media and also the polling industry, because they are very closely related to one another, have evolved over the last couple of decades here in Manitoba. And so a lot of what we talk about is kind of the different, the ownership structure, the different media outlets in the province, and also some of the ways that how the media has really changed in the last decade or so, and talking a little bit about, especially with social media, that's how so many people get information now, and it's also what politicians are using to communicate. And you just have to see the many very popular videos that Wab Kinew has made about and that's become a really primary way for him to communicate and reach people and that sort of thing. And so that's something that we look at as well. And then also just talk about the public opinion research industry and how and Chris and Chris is also working, and some of his other work is also about the history of polling, the public opinion research in Canada, and how that's changing, and technology and different ways of reaching people. And so we talk about that a little bit, and we talk about the role that that polling companies, and especially Pro Research, have played in terms of holding that mirror up and helping the public understand. I think the one thing that I guess it's not so much in the chapter, but I think I would take away is that I think we're actually fairly lucky in Manitoba. We have really strong media outlets. We've had a partnership for many years with the Free Press in terms of doing polling and but also just the work that the Free Press does. And all the other media outlets, CNC, CTV, Global, CGOB, you name it, and even in this sort of environment of pressure and change, they've been and more fragmented audiences, they are really able to do relatively well in terms of still reaching people and having that civic conversation, if you will. And so, and I think that as part of that, that's been really important, but also just even to trying to measure on a regular basis what's happening and where we're at in terms of public opinion. I mean, there was an election in Newfoundland recently, as you know, and going into that election, no one had any idea really what was happening in terms of are the Liberals ahead or is it the Conservatives? There was just kind of an assumption that the Liberal government was going to cruise to victory there, and then the Conservatives won until there was a little bit of polling at the end, but otherwise very little. And so I think that's something that we've tried to do, and I think other firms who do public opinion research here have tried to do that. And I think one of the things I really take away, and I think I hope comes across in the chapter, is that I think here in Manitoba, compared to a lot of other provinces, we're in fairly good stead, I think, in terms of how we get information about our democracy and our leaders and our government and that sort of thing. So it was a real pleasure to dig into that. And again, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks, Chris. So our next author, Jeremy Patzer. And Jeremy Patzer and I first met when we were doing an edited book on Métis in Canada. And Kelly had a chapter in there, and it was a very rewarding experience to meet Jeremy through that book project. So Jeremy did the chapter for this book, Where in History, Indigenous Peoples and Rights in 21st Century Manitoba. Over to you, Chairman.
Okay, thank you so much. First, to start off, I'll say that I read the semiotics through my thought properly as a contributor walking in and seeing the empty front row, and I knew that's where the contributors go. And then I see the entire row was pretty much empty, so I thought, it's really only going to be me who's going to come up and do this. So in a mad panic before walking up, I prepared another 75-minute, all of my background, 75-minute lecture.
Not again.
No, okay, but as clearly what happened is all my fellow colleagues decided to be the bad students who try to hide in the crowd so they don't get called upon. But yes, I put something together here. And I better get going, I recognize, but Chris, I do just want to say, yes, it's been a number of years now, it's been a pleasure working with you multiple times, but after hearing the introduction of Fletcher, I have to say that this book chapter, I took note, did not get me bacon and eggs. So I'm going to make the walk sometime this school year over to St. Paul's College and collect my fee.
Well, Daniel McLeod and I have been inviting you for a year and a half.
Yeah, okay, well. All right, we're gonna do it. All right, as far as my chapter, I have to introduce myself as being an interloper. I'm not a political science, I'm not a policy wonk, I'm a sociologist. I do sociology of law. My area of specialty is Indigenous rights. And so I needed to find a little bit of a niche or an angle that I can bring myself into the book. I think it worked here. But I asked this larger question as a framing then. What I also did, I draw a portrait of the landscape, the current history, the history and the current situation of Indigenous peoples in Manitoba. And then I asked this framing question of, has the province kept up with the times insofar as its conduct towards Indigenous peoples is concerned? And right after that, I try this effort towards a broad periodization, right? And I try to make it kind of really broad strokes here. We know that early history of the formation of Canada, the nation building, and bringing Manitoba into Confederation, it's this period of basically dispossession and assimilation, and that's the goal of the Crown and the government, and that's their view as insofar as the future is concerned with Indigenous peoples. But we do have this moment starting about a half century ago now. It's the late 60s, early 1970s, where the courts start changing their tune. The upper level appeal courts in provinces, especially BC, and then the Supreme Court of Canada, and I call that the Indigenous rights turn. We're happening in the late 60s and 70s and onward, and we've kind of been in that period since then for the past 50 years of this Indigenous rights turn. And so some of the things that you probably hear about in the news and the media and things like that, where they say, oh, constitutional rights, the duty to consult, honor of the Crown, those types of principles, that's what's being built up here. And those are the kinds of lenses of scrutiny being brought to bear on provinces and on the federal government insofar as their relationship and their activities in regards to Indigenous peoples. So then I also bring into this, though, this idea of a third stage, which is even beyond the Indigenous rights turn, where we can talk about the hope for a Crown-Indigenous relationship that is yet to come, that even goes beyond just that minimal bar set by the Supreme Court of Canada. And that's where we talk about things, and you hear Indigenous people talking about things like implementing actual self-determination with this commensurate partnership of Indigenous peoples in Canadian federalism, but also talking about things, and you're going to be hearing news stories in the past year related to this. Some of those foundational things that are only being spoken of now in really significant ways, the mutual benefit and the economic self-sustainability that was meant to be in the original treaty relationship, the original agreements, the original relationship with the Crown. And I say you hear about that, but you don't maybe hear those terms around mutual benefit or self-sustainability, but you're hearing news stories about class action or representative action lawsuits related to, what about treaty annuity payments? Are they meant to stay at $4 or $5 every year for 150 years? Or should those have been indexed to inflation? And other kinds of questions like that. So my ultimate contention, though, when I talk about in this broad kind of portrait of these several stages of history, is that Manitoba, like so many provinces, we still have elements of the 19th and early 20th century, those dispossessory politics. We have a hard time even finding our way into the current era of Indigenous rights, let alone leading the way toward that just relationship yet to come, envisioned by Indigenous nations themselves. I probably should leave it at that, though. I don't want to go on too long. I don't know how many of us we have come here since they're all hiding in the background. yeah, that's chapter 9. Check it out. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. Jeremy pointed out there are some empty seats up here, so Jeremy's a bit lonely. So those standing in the back, if you want to come to the front and grab a seat here, please
I'm
feel
gonna
free
lie
to do
down
so.
now.
So one of the authors who's hiding in the back is Aaron Moore, who's a University of Winnipeg professor, and I was really glad that he accepted to write. Kelly and I invited him to write the chapter on municipal government and politics in Manitoba. So Aaron, over to you.
Hello, thank you for having me here today, and again, thank you for inviting me to participate in reading this book. I was told just to talk off the cuff, and I've seen everybody else is actually prepared, or they're just a lot better at thinking while they talk than I am. But I
Royce Coop had PowerPoint slides.
yeah, I could imagine we would. So, but I was spending my time listening to people and trying to think what I was going to say. But when Kelly and Chris actually reached out to me initially, they asked me to write a chapter on Winnipeg, because I tend to write on big cities. But I already had one chapter on Winnipeg, and I have another chapter of Winnipeg I was working on. And I'm like, I don't want to write a third chapter on Winnipeg within a few years. So I decided to write about municipalities in Manitoba. And you know, I teach municipal government, but I tend to focus on the large cities. I've been doing it for 12 years, and I realized how little I still know about you know, the smaller, particularly rural municipalities in this province. And what often happens when I write something is it becomes relevant as it gets published, and not because I intended it to. But we recently had an Auditor General's report focusing on 4 different municipalities, one of which was scammed out of money, and questions about the provincial government's oversight of these municipalities. And I talk about in the chapter the need for our municipalities and for the politics of our municipalities to provide better transparency and oversight. They are often very much overlooked by the public. A lot of people do not vote in municipal elections in smaller municipalities in particular. A lot of people don't want to run. But they do account for a significant amount of the services we're provided, and municipalities are responsible for 60% of the infrastructure in Canada. And we have a massive infrastructure deficit in part because of that. So, you know, it was very worthwhile. And I think that's what I like about books like this, because it wasn't about, well, I never really theory test, I just pretend to do that. But it wasn't about writing a specific article about a specific topic. It was about learning about municipalities beyond the city of Winnipeg. And what often happens, particularly in a province like Manitoba, is you have one very large city, all the media focus, all the attention of academics focuses on that one city. So this was a great opportunity to look beyond that, and it's also helped because there aren't a lot of political scientists who study cities in Canada. I'm one of, you know, I can count them all on my hands. Winnipeg is unusual in that it has a lot written on it by political scientists. There's a history here. But what happens, because I also am willing to talk to the media, is I'll get calls. Not that long ago, I think it was the municipality of 2 borders. And I was like, what is the municipality of 2 borders? But I had to learn very quickly about the ward system. And I learned new things about, oh, we have multi-member district wards in Manitoba. I was not aware of that. And I actually had to change the chapter very late in the process to reflect some of the things I was unaware of. And I'm still concerned that there's something wrong in that chapter. But at the same time, I don't think anybody else will know. So it's probably okay. But these types of books are great. I very much believe in writing for general public and doing research that is accessible for everyone. And, you know, as you may know, academics aren't always great at doing that. And this book for sure is written for the public, and just looking at the turnout here, I think, you know, we've received great reception so far, and I hope it's very useful for people to better understand their government in the province. Thank you.
The next person we had up, as I mentioned earlier, is very much under the weather, Royce Coop, but I should put a plug in for his book with Tamara Small. Tamara Small and Royce Coop just put out a book earlier this year with University of Toronto Press, and it's somewhat like this book, only about elections in Canada. and both Kelly and I had a chapter. We were blowing our own horn, Kelly, but Kelly did one on electoral redistribution in Canada because she's on the Boundaries Commission for Canada, and I did one on polling in Canada. So, but that's a good book about elections in Canada by Tamara Small and Royce Kuhn. There, Royce, I did it for you. Okay, so the next two chapters, Royce did the one on the Progressive Conservative Party, and the last two chapters are on the other two major parties in Manitoba. And so the next chapter was my chapter on the NDP. And as Aaron was talking about, you know, there's been a lot of work about Winnipeg and the politics of Winnipeg. And the NDP really came out of the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. And the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation was an amalgamation of farmer movements along with the Independent Labour Party out of Winnipeg and the League for Social Reconstruction, mostly out of Toronto. But my chapter really talks about the history of the NDP, where it came from, and then it moves into some of the bylaws of the NDP, how they choose their leader, and so on and so forth. One of the things about this book, all the chapters, the book, most of the chapters were done by the time that the previous election came out. But after Wab Kinew was elected, we went back to all our authors who said, if you want to update a few things. So the chapters were updated to after the election. So my chapter on the NDP, as well as Royce's and Kelly's, we did update it to the results of the thing. And before I switch over to you, Kelly, I should just do a shout out to Shipra Verma, who's the Chief Electoral Officer for Manitoba. And she gave us permission to put in the appendix of our book the history of election regulations and laws going back to 1870. And Kelly and I also have all the results of all the provincial elections going back to 1870. So that's my chapter. So over to you, Kelly, about the Liberal Party. And I noticed John Gerard is here, which is kind of nice, the past leader. So you have to speak nicely about John.
Oh,
Kelly.
wow. Okay, gee, now I need to do a reboot. No, it was a pleasure to write the chapter on the Manitoba Liberal Party, and you know, and I really framed it around. I've written a fair bit on the Progressive Conservative Party, so this was a little bit of a switch for me, but an enjoyable one. And I really framed the chapter around what I call the conundrum of liberalism in Manitoba. And by that I mean that, you know, on the face of it, we should have a more successful Liberal Party provincially than we do, for several reasons. First of all, we have a long history of liberalism and Liberal dominance in the province, really up until the 1960s, as Chris has written so eloquently about in his own book. That Liberal Party in coalition with other political parties and had long dominated Manitoba politics, and then of course only to be displaced by Ed Schreier and the NDP, and then Duck Roblin and Progressive Conservatives. But we have that history there. We also have a very moderate political culture, right? We're middle of the road, we're centrist, we're practical, we're pragmatic. As one of our contributors that wrote that chapter on political culture points out. So that would suggest that there is an appetite for liberalism, which is known to be a very moderate centrist ideology. And then, of course, we've had the success of the federal Liberal Party here, right? Certainly, we know Justin Trudeau's election in 2015 really saw a significant number of Liberal MPs, and then also as well, just even in the last election. So it's not like Manitobans are averse to voting Liberal. So then what explains the fact that we've got a Liberal Party today that, you know, has really been struggling and has been struggling really since about the 1980s to really resonate with voters. Right now, we only have one Liberal MLA in the Manitoba legislature, which is not even official party status. The party has long struggled to find volunteers and candidates and money. Yet they've always put out what I think are really strong policy ideas in every election. So what is going on here? And so to cut to the chase and to not keep you in suspense any longer, what I look at is I look at the ways in which the other two dominant parties, the NDP and the Conservatives, play a really, you know, pretty strategic game at really squeezing out that center where the Liberal Party would sit. So we see an NDP party shifting a little bit more left of center, and then the Progressive Conservatives a little more right of center, but still crowding around that mushy middle, sort of not being too extreme, either too left or too right. which would give space for a Liberal Party to really be able to win seats and win votes. So it's just the Liberal Party really getting squeezed out of the middle that really has unfortunately clouded their opportunity to really grow. But who knows? You know, Manitobans, we get frustrated with one party, then we kick them out after 8 years, and then we vote for the other guys, and then we get frustrated with them, and we kind of go back and forth. What the future will hold, if we get fundamentally frustrated with those two options and really look for a third option, only time will tell, but that's the tragic story of the Manitoba Liberal Party.
So I want to ask you a question before we move on to the audience. You know, we had the Selinger government, deeply unpopular by the end of its period. It had the Gang of Five walking out.
Five, yeah.
PST and Pallister was the new leader of the Progressive Conservatives, and there was a real opportunity in that election for Rana Bakari's Liberals. And much like Sharon Carstairs in the 80s, she had an opportunity and she ran with it. The lady in red, she was called, some of you might remember. But maybe you could talk a little bit about that opening for the Liberals that they didn't succeed in.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a few openings, but that certainly was one, you know, that where we should have seen the stars were aligning for the Manitoba Liberals. And it seems that, you know, when you talk to voters, you know, during opinion polls, as Curtis knows, you know, typically around 15% of Manitobans will say, yeah, I like the Liberals, you know, but when it comes to election time, it's almost like voters get scared, right? They're scared of voting for an alternative party in some ways, and also they vote strategically. They're like, what are the chances that the Liberals are going to win, right? I might not like the NDP or the Conservatives, but it's going to be one of them, and so I might as well go ahead and vote for them. So it seems like voters really hesitate to park their vote, even if their hearts might be leading in that direction. And the Liberals just aren't able to really get over that hump.
I would say there's also the players in the party, right? Like you see in all three of the parties, players make a significant difference. Duff Roblin made a significant difference to the PCs in the late 1950s. We saw Ed Schreier making a significant difference in '69. And I would say, like Rana Bakari, the running of that campaign was a very problematic campaign compared to Sharon Carstairs' campaign in the 1980s. So the individual players, like Gary Doer is an individual player, has really ran with his approach to how to do the NDP. And Wab Kinew, we see his strength in decisions and being somewhat charismatic. And if there was someone else leading the NDP, maybe they wouldn't be doing so well right now.
Yeah, so my last question to you very quickly, because I know we're at 7:45. So you wrote a great chapter on the NDP. We're at the midterm mark for the NDP. Where do you think they're moving? Is the honeymoon period starting to erode a little bit?
Well, you know, Kelly and I should let you know, we had thought of doing this thing at McNally Robinson because we're kind of at the second year anniversary of the Kinew government, and we thought it'd be good to sort of bring together some thoughts about this. I would say Kinew is still doing very well. He's still got a very good national profile. There's a lot of talk this week about Wab Kinew's law and order type position taking on the Supreme Court's decision about pedophilia, and we'll hear at the coming NDP convention if there's some concern about that. I think it's mostly lawyers who are concerned about his criticism of the Supreme Court. But I would say that the honeymoon is still on. Curtis Brown's company with their polling, we still see high numbers in Winnipeg, and that's Fortress Winnipeg, where most of the seats are. I think the outside of Winnipeg, I think there'll be some dissipation of the support for Kinew over the next year or so. But I think that we're still in the honeymoon period, and Angus Reid Institute still says Kinew is the most popular of all the provinces. When you rate the premiers within each of the provinces, Kinew is the #1 rated premier by his own citizens. It used to be Scott Moe or Doug Ford, but it's Francois Legault who's really dropped in Quebec. But Kinew is really still doing very, very well.
All right, great. Okay, now maybe we can open it up to questions. I think we've got about 15 minutes roughly for questions. Is that okay? Yeah, so please tell us your thoughts, your perspectives, any questions you've got about to any of our contributors.
First off, I'd like to thank both of you for an excellent book. I picked it up last night, and you've read it already. Okay, great. Well, one of the gems is Appendix A, where in 1920 the city of Winnipeg had a form of proportional representation, and lasted till about 1957. As an active member of the Green Party, what do you think might have been the difference had proportional representation continued to this day? How would this book have sounded a little different? Would the Green Party have had more than 1% of the vote? So the Green Party and the Provincial Liberal Party are really affected badly by the rules of the game. That is, first past the post in each of the ridings, you can get 20% of the vote in every riding across Manitoba and still not have a single MLA elected for your party. And that's the national situation as well for the Green Party and the Liberal Party. I would say though that there was a lot of experimentation in Manitoba with the Winnipeg voters and with PR, but also they had other weird things. They split the city into different one half, and you elect a couple of candidates from each of the two wards. But these games of how MLAs were elected out of Winnipeg, only Winnipeg, was to suppress the impact of urban voting. So if you're a voter outside of Winnipeg, the electors had more power than those within. So Winnipeg wasn't able to dominate the legislature in the way that they might have in other provinces. But in the mid-50s and the mid-60s, that eventually got redone, as Kelly knows, the redistribution. But one time I interviewed Ed Schreier for one of my earlier pieces, and I said, if they hadn't redone where they made Winnipeg the majority of seats, the Winnipeg area, you think you could have had your breakthrough in 69. And Schreier looked around, looked at the microphone, looked at me again, and this was a recording, and he said very reluctantly, probably not. But that was the rules of the system had affected, and it was positive for Schreier because things have been redone by the late 1960s. But the NDP's success has largely been urban voters in Manitoba with some of the North. So
this is why I enjoyed running the book with Chris. It's just a walking font of knowledge, historic and history details.
My mother used to say, you have a head full of useless information.
Hi, and thanks for doing this. It's good to see you again. Quick observation. I've only had a chance to read the first chapter, and I was surprised at the first question in the first sentence, which is the political history of Manitoba dull? It's a loaded question because if the answer had been yes, what the rest of you guys do? So it was loaded. But the more serious question is that the author, and unfortunately, Robert Coots is not here tonight. He mentions that Manitoba is the only province to enter Confederation to the sound of guns. Is that to make us sound less dull, or what is he talking about?
Well, I mean, if I can speak for Bob a little bit, yeah, I mean, to the first issue, I mean, we really wanted to counter this idea of Manitoba being boring and dull. We're in the middle. Who cares? We're not sexy like Alberta or Ontario. We're really, brash and out there. But yet our own story is so fascinating and it's dynamic, and we've had crises and we've had challenges and unique things that have been happening here that we really feel that we needed to tell the story. But absolutely, one of the absolutely unique things, and I think really impressive things, and something that I'm so proud of, is that we are the only province to have entered Confederation led by an Indigenous people, and that is Louis Riel and the Métis, our honorary first premier and father of Confederation, for many of us, came from Manitoba. And we are the only province to be able to claim that. And I think that really, sets us apart from the other provinces. But as Bob talks about, the ideas and the values and the presence, the dominant presence of the Métis and First Nations peoples in Manitoba really helped shape and inform our political culture. So even though we've had major challenges and crises, he talks about this idea of Mkutuan, that we've always been able to find a way to come together and find that consensus and that compromise, which is very much of an Indigenous value. And so that's, I think, one of the really unique special things about Manitoba. So, yeah.
But I would also, and I agree with you, Kelly, I would also add the fact that Manitoba in many ways represents all of Canada. We have a francophone population, which sure enough has dwindled, but we have a north. We have a big north in Manitoba. We have a large urban population. Winnipeg is 2/3 of our province. So we have urban labor politics, we have suburban politics, we have farmer politics, we have Indigenous politics, we have northern politics. So in many ways, Manitoba is a microcosm for all of Canada. And one of our ridings in South Winnipeg, as many of you know, whichever way South Winnipeg goes, so goes the nation in federal elections. That's been the case for many decades. So in many ways, what happens in Manitoba is many ways what we see across the country.
We have time for a couple more questions there. Yeah.
Hi, I'm enjoying this very much. It's a lot of fun. And you're both quite witty, and that makes it.
She's more charming than me.
Mascara. Anyway, what I want to discuss is political self-interest in obstructing electoral reform. I too am with the gentleman who asked the first question. And I too am a rabid proportional representation person. And I know that, even Ed Schreier, whom I adore, admitted that first past the post really gave him his power. But we need to get past that. We need a Liberal Party that gets seats in proportion to their vote. We don't need people to be voting strategically. And it's political self-interest that obstructs the way forward. So how do you get around that?
I mean, that's $1 million question, I mean, yeah, I mean, you're right. It for the parties that are in power, and we'll stick with Manitoba, obviously, the NDP and the Progressive Conservatives, you just said it's not in their interest. The system works for them, right? They keep getting reelected, and it's only voters. Yeah, absolutely. Voters really feel frustrated, and that's where even talking about the Liberal Party, people, even if their heart is there or with the Greens or any other political party, the chances of those candidates getting in or forming government are just next to none. So voters check out, they get frustrated, they get disengaged. Yeah, and we see the increasing cynicism happening. So there is a growing divide, I think, in terms of what the elites want and what the people are wanting. But I know in Manitoba a few years ago, there was one of the previous governments was investigating the idea of maybe holding a commission or looking at a study, or Chris, you can maybe speak to that.
I don't remember Manitoba, that could have happened, but there have been a number of provinces where they've had plebiscites or referenda on changing the system, and for one reason or another, like in BC, it's been defeated. So it is a bit of a mug's game, but I do share your exasperation. And Justin Trudeau promised in 2015 we'd have it'd be 2015 would be the last election that we'd be voting in the way we were. Promised that. And there was all this noise, and we had round tables. We had Paul Thomas and I were in Transcona, a great town, by the way. We were out there, and we had people presenting at that, and there was a whole lot of noise, and nothing came of it. But it's very frustrating. I share the frustration.
Yeah, it's gonna have to come from the public. It's gonna have to be grassroots voters, Manitoba, Canada, really pressing for that change, because it's not gonna be the politicians. That's pretty clear. Politicians in power.
Glancing quickly over the book, I noticed that there is no chapter, or as far as I could see, not even a mention of French language rights in Manitoba. Now, over the last 3 decades or so, that has politically been a non-issue, and that is a good thing, because that means we have, reconciled, we have, come to an agreement, and it's a good thing. But throughout most of Manitoba history, the big crises have involved language rights. Arguably the biggest political crisis in Manitoba history was in the early 80s, the language crisis. Manitoba school questions just gathered, monopolized attention not only in Manitoba but across the country, ultimately leading to the defeat of the Federal Conservative Party. Manitoba was exercised a kind of a leadership across Canada that way, but the wrong kind of leadership. You may recall Francis Russell's book, The Canadian Crucible, where she said, Manitoba is where the dream of Confederation died. You can draw a straight line. I think she overdid it. I don't agree with that. But there's a. I'm just curious whether it was by design or by oversight, or that this was not covered at all.
I was going to have Michelle, like I say, answer this one, but I won't. I think it's an indication how it really has receded as a major issue. You're right, the Francophone, the French language. My mother, Louise Bellier, would ask the same question. Why didn't you have the Francophones in your Manitoba book? But it does, there are some elements in different chapters where it comes up, the issue of the French language rights in the PC chapter, I think is covered in there. But you're right, it's not a big issue, but I think it just shows how Manitoba as a society has sort of moved along. The French population has been swamped, and the English language has taken over. So that's just the reality. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's just one of those, as we mentioned earlier, French language issues certainly are spoken about in some of the chapters. We don't have a specific chapter on that. There was many other ideas we wanted to include. Would have loved a chapter on healthcare, one of the biggest, public challenges we're facing, on the environment, on climate change. And so there were a few things we had to leave out, unfortunately. But I think it is, Chris just alluded to, it really shows the fact that we've had these flashpoints throughout history. But again, we've been able to find our way through them. And not that the resolutions are always ideal or perfect or settle the issues, but we are nonetheless, as a province, that's one of our hallmarks, I think, is to be able to find a way to come together despite our differences, and one of our strengths.
I was disappointed that you didn't allow me to do the craft beer chapter. So,
yes, that's true. That should have been chapter number one.
Yeah, I think you have time for one more very quick question there.
Well, after the conversation this evening, I'm even more excited to read the book. Personalities of the contributors and thoughts shared are wonderful. My first reaction is a missing element. I think, I may be wrong, but it seems to me that Manitoba punches above its weight significantly in the arts. And yet, is there anything about the arts and role of the arts and the development of Manitoba in the book?
No, but that's a great point. See, we need a second volume, right?
That's right,
We
yeah.
can talk about Francophone peoples, we can talk about the arts, we can talk about Chris and craft beer, for goodness sakes. But you're absolutely right. I mean, we think about, the Royal Winnipeg Ballet, we think about the Manitoba Opera, we talk about our symphony. We have an incredibly rich, vibrant art scene with new and emerging artists here. that absolutely is warrants its own attention, and unfortunately, we weren't able to cover that.
And Jeremy Raymond Curry behind you is a sociologist, just so you know, you aren't alone. Okay, well, thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. This is fun.
Yeah, so yeah, question.
Well, I have a comment. This is my first experience of attending something like this. And it's very interesting, so much knowledge in different areas. But I feel that there should be polarization about so much problem. Extreme right just dumb the extreme left. And we miss a lot of points and a lot of good ideas. And what we've got to look at ourselves, in my opinion, in Manitoba and what we contribute. And I think where we can start is books like yours would be in the school, you know, part of our curriculum in 7 or 8, 9, starting then, because trying to teach old dogs new tricks is a very hard job. And I think that I really commend you on your work, and I'd like to see these happen. But one of the things that's missing here, in my opinion, I'm numbers guy. We don't put numbers beside some of these things that take priority. You can't conquer the world all at one time. And I think that taking these things and coming up with established ideas and putting numbers beside it, forget about the politics.
Yeah, okay.
Putting the numbers beside these things, and we can get, I like to think that our schools should be more, very more these things.
Good. So thanks very much. And I can't speak for Kelly, but I think I would be willing to come into a school and speak on any teachers here. I'm happy to come out to maybe in the Brandon School Division as well. So thank you very much for that. Yeah. Over to you, Daniel.
Awesome. Yeah. And thank you all for being here tonight and for your questions. That was lovely. Great presentation from our contributors today. So big thanks to all of you for being here. We are going to move on to the signing portion as well. Feel free to have a book signed before you visit the cash desk. I know there's going to be a lineup over here. I'm going to clear some of the chairs out for you before then. But yeah, so long as you pay for it before you leave, we're very happy for that. Thank you all for coming today. Thank you all for watching. A big thank you again to University of Manitoba Press. And then, of course, to our very special guests, Kelly Saunders and Christopher Adams. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very good.